In the winter of 1944, as the Second World War edged toward its grim crescendo, a convoy of British military lorries crept through the frost-hardened hills of Yorkshire like rusting beasts of burden. Their engines coughed steam into the morning air, tires crunching across icy gravel as the snow-dusted moors stretched out in somber silence. The countryside offered no welcome, only pale light filtering through skeletal trees and the heavy breath of December winds. Inside the canvas-covered backs of the trucks sat nearly 60 German prisoners of war, the worn, the wounded, the bewildered. The prisoners said little. Most were young, scarcely older than boys, bundled in whatever scraps of uniform they had been captured in. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, traced the ridgelines and hedgerows of this unfamiliar land. There were men from the sunken U-boats of the Atlantic, Luftwaffe cadets shot down over French hedgerows, and Wehrmacht infantry plucked from the ruins of Normandy. They had once carried orders. Now they carried only silence. Some tried to make sense of the landscape. Others stared at the scuffed boots across from them, clinging to thoughts of home. The convoy snaked toward its destination, Camp Barley Edge, an aging estate that had been commandeered, fenced, and converted into a temporary prison complex by the British War Office. Barley Edge Hall had once been a grand country manor with ornamental gardens and polished floors. Now it bristled with barbed wire, searchlights, and watchtowers cobbled from sandbags and salvaged timber. At the main gate, a rusted iron sign still hung, the letters Barleyage barely visible beneath layers of soot and war grime. British sentries with Enfield rifles manned the entrance, their breath fogging in the morning chill. The man who ran the camp was Commander Reginald Fry, a hardened veteran of the Great War whose limp from a Somme trench injury lent a slow but deliberate rhythm to his stride. Fry believed in rules more than he believed in mercy. Discipline, order, hierarchy. These were the bedrocks of civility, and any attempt to introduce emotion into the equation, he argued, only led to rot. His leather gloves were always spotless, and his spectacles perpetually smudged, as if he could see the world more clearly through abstraction than clarity. As the trucks hissed to a stop and tailgates clanged open, the prisoners were herded out into the snow-packed yard. British guards shouted names from worn ledgers, their clipped accents slicing through the morning air. Each man was processed under the hard gaze of the administration hut. Fingerprints were taken, names recorded, ranks stripped down to labels. All were issued the same regulation gray wool uniform with the letters P.W. for Prisoner of War, painted in thick, clumsy white across the back like an accusation. Among them stood Hans Eberhardt, a thin-limbed 19-year-old whose winter coat hung from his shoulders like borrowed skin. Hans had been pulled from the remains of his unit after a shelling outside Caen. He had not wanted to fight. His older brother, Friedrich, had died in the mud of Arnhem, and Hans had spent the remainder of the war trying to be invisible. Captivity, strange as it seemed, was almost a relief, but that did not mean he trusted it. Beside him, slightly older and wearing glasses perpetually in danger of falling off his nose, stood Corporal Otto Kessler. Before the war, he had been a teacher of literature and music in a small village near Leipzig. Now, he clutched a tattered copy of Goethe's Faust in his coat pocket like a relic of a previous life. Otto did not speak unless spoken to. He carried himself with quiet dignity and observed the guards and camp layout with the careful detachment of someone used to interpreting subtext. As the gates groaned shut behind them, Hans felt the world shift. They were no longer men with pasts. They were files in a cabinet, rows in a ledger, units to be fed and guarded until some unnamed authority deemed them no longer dangerous. Some of the younger POWs exchanged whispers about what fate might await them: hard labor, punishment, or worse. Others looked up at the gray stone of the manor and wondered if anyone still lived inside. The wind swept across the yard, carrying with it the high whistle of something ancient and indifferent. The prisoners were marched to their assigned barracks, converted stables with iron bunk frames and shared coal stoves that only half worked. The British Guards barked orders with mechanical efficiency, offering no cruelty but no comfort either. There was no laughter in Camp Barley Edge, only protocol. As night fell and the men settled into their wooden bunks, the sounds of boots echoed across the compound, changing of the guard, the clatter of tin dishes, the distant bark of a radio. Outside, the trees stood still, stripped bare and waiting. Inside, Hans lay awake, staring at the timber beams above him. Otto scribbled notes in the margins of his book, documenting every detail of the arrival. The faces, the tone, the tension. Most of the men expected hostility. Some expected starvation. None expected what was to come. The guards barked orders, the gates closed behind them, and the wind howled like a warning through the bare trees. The war was over for us, they said, but we did not yet believe it. Camp Barley Edge was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was. A monument to protocol carved into the Yorkshire frost. Beneath its slate skies and strict routines, the camp moved with clockwork austerity. Every action was metered, timed, and filed. The guards rotated in clean shifts every 8 hours, saluting with gloved hands and eyes that rarely made contact. Wake-up calls rang at 0600 sharp. Meals arrived in aluminum trays that clattered like war medals, boiled potatoes, cabbage, margarine, and an unidentifiable soup that varied only in color, never in taste. It filled the stomach, but not the spirit. The prisoners, numbering just over 200, were assigned to local civilian tasks. The terms dictated by Allied policies meant to reinforce that war was lost, but utility remained. Some worked textile mills in the valley. Others repaired shattered roads. A few, like Hans Eberhardt, found themselves marching down to the railway depot each morning to clear snow and debris from the lines. They worked under supervision, yet without conversation. The English guards, though not overtly brutal, enforced distance as if it were military law. Hans was paired with Private Malcolm Wainwright, a carpenter by trade, soldier by order. Wainwright rarely spoke, not because he hated the Germans, perhaps he did, perhaps he didn't, but because the camp demanded silence in everything but command. A simple nod between them became the most they shared in weeks. When Hans once pointed at a broken sled runner and made a vague gesture to fix it, Wainwright crouched wordlessly and repaired it with a pocket plane and a square of scavenged oak. No thanks was offered, none was expected. In the barracks, where frost bit through drafty walls and the stove ran low on coal, conversations were whispered and careful. Otto Kessler, ever the observer, had taken to writing in the evenings. He used pencil stubs and blank margins of old tobacco cartons to record his thoughts. "Efficiency without empathy," he scribbled one night. "They feed us, house us, protect us from the cold. And yet it feels as if we are alone inside a perfectly functioning machine." A former schoolteacher, Otto viewed systems through the lens of morality. And though he respected order, he mourned the absence of soul. The mail card arrived once a week, usually on Thursdays, to more silence. Red Cross parcels were promised to every prisoner under the Geneva Convention, but reality warped promises. Boxes arrived battered, their seals broken, contents lightened. Nobody asked questions. To ask was to suggest insult, and insult could lead to punishment. The men opened each parcel with ritual restraint, a tin of meat, crackers, perhaps chocolate. But one afternoon, a small box marked Kessler, Otto, 219/B caused a stir. Inside the crumpled wrapping was a single tin of sardines, and, folded carefully beneath, a child's drawing on yellowed paper. Crayon marks etched out a scene of 3 men in striped clothes standing next to a snowman, all smiling. Above them, a rudimentary Union Jack flew from a crooked pole. In the corner, written in blocky English, "I hope you are warm." The barracks fell quiet as Otto held it up to the light. The crayon lines had smudged, perhaps from damp fingers or the long journey. Murmurs circled. A trick? A message? Poison ink? Hans leaned in, eyebrows drawn. Is it real? Kessler, unsure, brought it to Commander Fry the next morning during work detail reporting. Fry took one look, blinked, and dismissed it with a dry scoff. Some village brat's mistake, he muttered. Disregard it. But Otto didn't disregard it. He tucked the drawing into the inner lining of his coat, where the fabric had thinned from months of wear. He didn't speak of it again. Not to Hans, not even in his diary. But he folded it again each night before sleep, smoothed the creases with care, and held it between his palms as if trying to read something deeper inside the scrawl. Perhaps the boy existed. Perhaps he didn't. But in a place where days were measured by rations and patrol whistles, something that didn't have to be given mattered more than something that did. Meanwhile, discipline within the camp remained firm. Guards kept distance. Germans kept heads down. Rules were printed in 6 languages and nailed to every barrack wall. No contact with locals. No leaving assigned areas. No possessions except issued items. The men obeyed, not out of loyalty, but out of exhaustion. Only Wainwright seemed to bend slightly. On a particularly bitter morning, Hans fumbled with his gloves, fingers numb and clumsy. The wind sliced through the yard like razors. Without a word, Wainwright reached into his own kit bag and handed Hans a woolen scarf. It was dark green, hand-knitted, worn at the edges. No acknowledgement passed between them. That evening, Hans folded it neatly under his cot and stared at the ceiling for hours. Otto saw it, said nothing. Later that week, Otto wrote one line in his diary and nothing else. Perhaps the war has ended, but its shadow continues to march. It was these small inconsistencies, the scarf, the drawing, the repaired sled, that created fractures in the men's understanding of captivity. They had expected guards who shouted, not ones who turned their backs while you stole an extra potato. They had expected starvation, not bland nourishment served on time. They had expected hatred. What they received was distance, meticulous, institutional, impenetrable distance, the kind of silence that wasn't neutral but rehearsed, the kind that came from a nation trying very hard not to care and failing, ever so slightly. They gave us soup, shovels, and silence, but not understanding. 2 weeks before Christmas, the frost lay heavy across the Yorkshire moors like a second sky, soft and pale. Each morning, camp barleyage stirred to the same staccato rhythm, boots on gravel, the bark of orders, the distant ring of the chapel bell from the village below. But one morning, that rhythm cracked. A faint murmur reached the guard tower first, like wind threading through hedgerows. Then came the unmistakable sound of children's voices. Not crying, not laughing, speaking, purposeful yet unsure, as if practicing lines from a forgotten play. At the north perimeter fence, 4 boys in wool coats and scuffed shoes stood in a line. They weren't hiding. They weren't playing. Each carried something in their arms, parcels, jars, what looked like bundled cloth. Leading them was a man with a narrow frame and thick-rimmed spectacles, one arm raised like a peacekeeper in a photo. He stepped closer to the fence and spoke with the kind of voice that belonged in classrooms, not prison camps. "Good morning. We're from Langridge Primary. This is part of a class project on reconciliation." His voice faltered under the scrutiny of 2 rifle barrels aimed with neither malice nor patience. "I assure you, it's authorized. Or at least not forbidden." Commander Reginald Fry arrived within minutes, greatcoat flapping like the wings of a hawk. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His eyes, cold as the frost, did the speaking. "This is a secure military site, mister?" "Brigg. Thomas Brigg. Year 4, teacher. We've come with small parcels. The children wrote letters. And some made things. I can take full responsibility. The youngest boy in the group, no older than 9, stepped forward. From under his coat he withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and string. He looked straight through the fence where a few German POWs had gathered, heads tilted like deer, unsure whether to run. One prisoner, Hans Eberhardt, stood stillest of all. His hands were at his sides, his eyes locked with the boy's. A strange current passed between them, neither recognition nor fear, but something older. The boy pushed the parcel under the lowest gap in the fence, through a break in the barbed base. The glider came first, its wings whittled with careful hands, then the biscuits, folded in wax paper, then the scarf. Hans didn't move. He looked at the guard. "Take it," said the corporal. He didn't say it twice. Hans bent slowly and retrieved the parcel. The glider felt smooth, warmer than expected. He turned it in his hands, noting the initials, A.D., etched beneath one wing. He glanced back at the boy. The boy smiled. The moment was broken by Fry's voice, curt and final. "This will not continue. Mr. Brigg, I'll be filing an official reprimand with your school board. You are to leave immediately." Brigg bowed slightly, ushering the boys back. But as they left, one turned back and waved, not with flourish but with quiet insistence, as if to say, "This isn't finished." That night in the barracks, Hans placed the glider on the small shelf beside his cot. Otto Kessler examined it and gave a low whistle. "Some message, that." Hans nodded. "It's not a message. It's a question." "What kind of question?" "What if we're more than prisoners?" Elsewhere, Fry sat at his desk, drafting the complaint letter by lamplight. He paused only once, staring out the frost-flecked window at the distant trees. Something about the boy's eyes stayed with him. The next day came with the sound of boots again. Not military, but small and hurried. The same children. Different parcels. More gliders. This time, they didn't wait for permission. They lined up at the same stretch of fence, silently handing packages through the gap. Brigg stood behind them, but said nothing. Private Malcolm Wainwright, off duty and leaning on the windowsill of the East Barracks hut, watched with a frown that softened into something like wonder. He could have raised the alarm. He could have reported the trespass, but he didn't. Instead, he watched one of the boys give a tin of sweets to an older prisoner missing 2 fingers. The man took it with trembling hands. Wainwright turned from the window and lit a cigarette. He didn't say a word. No one taught those boys to hate, so they chose to give. The barracks of Camp Barley Edge were built for efficiency, not comfort. Drafts crept in through the floorboards. Thin wool blankets were the only defense against the cold. Rows of bunk beds created tight corridors of shadow and breath, and the constant presence of British guards outside gave the German prisoners little illusion of privacy. It was in this rigid atmosphere, just days after the schoolboys had first approached the perimeter fence, that the camp seemed to split, not along national lines, but between hope and suspicion. Some of the men called the children's visit a trap. Word spread fast among the prisoners. Alfred Dent's gift had passed from hand to hand like contraband. The glider, the scarf, the biscuits wrapped in waxed paper. To some, they were a marvel. To others, they were bait. One gaunt mechanic named Willie Krause claimed the glider had a listening device inside it, hidden in the wooden wing. Another, a former field sergeant named Meissner, tore open one of the biscuits and sniffed it like a bloodhound. "Cyanide has no scent," he muttered grimly. Kessler told him not to be ridiculous, but even he couldn't fully shake the feeling of doubt. "Why now?" someone whispered. "Why kindness now?" It was Kessler who opened the letter. Written in smudged pencil on floral stationery, the letter was signed, "From all of us at Langridge Primary." The handwriting was clearly a child's, wobbly loops and inconsistent spacing. Kessler squinted through his wire-rimmed glasses, mouthing each word as he tried to translate. He traced the final line twice. "We hope you are warm," it read. But in his tired mind, shaped by months of fear and deprivation, warm looked dangerously close to warned. He misread the message as a threat. "We hope you are warned." Otto folded the letter slowly, uncertain whether to share it or burn it. Hans sat nearby, his face blank. He had said little since the visit at the fence. Most assumed he was still processing the interaction, how the boy's eyes had met his, how a gift had come not with a taunt or insult, but with silent sincerity. Yet Hans's quiet was not just contemplation. It was guilt. That night, as snow ticked softly against the tin roof, Hans whispered to Kessler that he had not written to his mother since early summer. Not once. Not even when he was transferred from France. "What would I say?" he murmured. "That I'm alive, but not living. That I'm surrounded by men with rifles and rules?" He feared the British censors would misinterpret his words, or worse, his own mother might think him brainwashed or broken. So he had said nothing. Silence, at least, could not be misunderstood. Outside the barracks, the British guards were equally uncertain. None of them had been briefed on how to handle child visitors, let alone ones offering sweets and sympathy. One corporal named Perry, no older than 22, asked his superior if they should report the contact as a breach. "It's not in the manual," came the curt reply. Perry frowned. "It feels wrong, sir." Letting kids talk to prisoners like their pen pals, the superior didn't answer. He just lit a cigarette and turned toward the hut window, watching the prisoners line up for evening roll call. Back in the administrative office, Commander Reginald Fry was anything but passive. He had already penned 2 memos to the War Office, one condemning the breach of military protocol, the other demanding tighter control of civilian access to the camp perimeter. He feared fraternization, not because it was dangerous in a practical sense, but because it threatened something more abstract, victory's narrative. In his view, prisoners needed to remain prisoners, enemies had to remain enemies, and sentimentality was the mother of chaos. Sympathy, Fry once wrote in a private journal, is the first crack in the wall of duty. To prevent further contamination, he doubled the patrol shifts, removed Wainwright from outer perimeter duty, and assigned a new guard post near the fence line, facing the moors, where the school had stood for nearly a century. He also banned any unsanctioned post sent or received by prisoners without full translation and clearance. Meanwhile, in the village of Langridge, word of the commander's outrage reached the school. Mr. Thomas Brigg was formally reprimanded by the local council, accused of poor judgment and endangering minors. "You took children to the edge of a prison camp," barked a committee member during the closed-door review. "How do you justify that?" Brigg stood calmly, his hands folded behind his back. "They took gifts to the edge of a war," he said quietly, "and the only ones who flinched were the adults." Though the council issued a written warning, local clergy soon reached out to Brigg. A vicar named Reverend Lyle invited him to tea and offered quiet words of encouragement. "The war has taught us how to punish," Lyle said, stirring sugar into his cup. "But who is teaching us how to forgive?" Hans continued to wrestle with what he had seen and what he had felt. He wrote no letters, but that night he took a piece of coal and drew something on the inside of his bunk, a bird with outstretched wings, gliding above trees and wire. He said nothing when others asked about it. Not even when Otto noticed the glider bore a striking resemblance to the wooden one from Alfred's package. The true wedge in the camp was no longer between Briton and German, but between those who wanted to believe and those who couldn't afford to. Back in the corner of the barracks, Kessler stared at the child's letter again. He read it aloud this time, slower. When he reached the final line, his voice trembled. "We hope you are warm. Not warned. Warm." He folded it with care and tucked it into the inner lining of his coat. That night, for the first time in months, he dreamed not of barbed wire, but of home. None of it changed the outcome of the war, but it began to change the men. We had been trained to resist bullets. No one prepared us for kindness. December 24th, 1944, unfolded over Camp Barliage with a quiet more profound than usual. The snow that began falling before dawn had thickened into a soft white shroud by midday, muting every footstep and muffling every shout. The camp, already distant from any main road, tucked between moorland ridges and shadowy pine groves, seemed now entirely removed from the war that had brought these men here. The barracks, built of stone and timber, sagged slightly under the accumulating weight of snow. Icicles hung like glass bayonets from the eaves. Inside, the prisoners stirred only to adjust their collars, rub stiff hands, or glance at the high, narrow windows where daylight ebbed fast. There was no announcement of the date from the guards, no meal variation, no token of the season. Most of the prisoners didn't expect one. For them, Christmas existed in a place they could no longer reach, in family homes across ruined German cities, in churches where the bells had long fallen silent, in voices they might never hear again. Hans Eberhardt sat on his bunk, turning a small scrap of wood over in his fingers, a leftover from the crate he'd dismantled 2 weeks prior. He had begun carving it into a rough figure, something between a bird and an angel, though he wasn't sure why. He hadn't spoken to Otto that day. Few of them had spoken much at all. Even Otto Kessler, ever the philosopher, had grown quieter. He remained huddled in a corner near the small iron stove, scratching into his worn notebook by the poor light. Earlier, he had read aloud a passage from Goethe's Faust, but the words had trailed off when no one responded. He closed the book gently and placed it beside him as if ashamed to have tried. The guards, too, seemed subdued. They moved with their usual efficiency but without edge. Orders were short and clipped. Even the jeers some had come to expect, no snowballs, krauts, or make your peace with God, lads, were absent. Commander Fry's presence had been less visible in recent days. Rumor among the prisoners suggested that he was ill. Others said he was in correspondence with London, possibly about increased restrictions. No one knew for sure. What was clear was that morale on both sides of the wire was thinning. The sky darkened early. By 5 o'clock it was near black, save for the dull reflection of snow below and the faint orange haze rising from the village across the fields. The sound came just after supper, such as it was, boiled roots and one ladle of broth. At first, Hans thought it was the wind in the pines. Then the sound sharpened, broke free from the wind, and carried a shape he had not heard in a long time. Melody. Human melody. The prisoners froze in place. Even the most cynical among them, Corporal Meyer, who distrusted every smile from a guard, and Feldwebel Hahn, who had been a choir director before the war and now rarely spoke, looked up from their benches. From somewhere beyond the eastern fence, faint but clear, rose the old English carol. God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. Otto dropped his pencil. Hans was already on his feet. He darted to the window, brushing away condensation with his sleeve. The words rang out again, stronger this time, and in harmony. They weren't men's voices. These were children. Boys. The gate was too far to see from the barracks, but the direction was unmistakable. Others followed Hans to the window. The guards outside weren't moving to intervene. Not yet. Hans and a few others rushed out into the yard. No one stopped them. Snow crunched underfoot, and breath steamed in the air. The world felt suspended, like the ticking of a clock had paused. As they neared the fence, the scene came into view. A cluster of boys, perhaps a dozen, stood outside the perimeter, faces wrapped in scarves, small lanterns swinging in mittened hands. Behind them was Mr. Brigg, the schoolteacher, now wearing a long brown coat and a nervous expression. Wainwright stood inside the fence, unmoving. The boys had finished their first song and were now launching into a second, Stille Nacht. The German words, sung in thick Yorkshire accents, were oddly tender, as if shaped more by feeling than fluency. Hans clutched the fence with both hands, chest heaving. Otto arrived behind him, his breath catching at the sight. Other prisoners gathered in silence, staring as though the boys were ghosts conjured by the snow. Then movement. Wainwright stepped forward. He looked at the prisoners, then back toward the command hut. A long pause followed, the kind that tightens every nerve. Then he turned and marched purposefully toward the inner gate. He unlocked it. There was murmuring among the guards, but none moved to stop him. Wainwright continued toward Fry's quarters, vanishing inside. Inside, Fry was hunched over his desk. When Wainwright entered, he didn't rise. He merely looked up. "I believe this," Wainwright said, quietly but firmly. "Matters more than rules." For a moment, neither man moved. Fry's expression remained carved in stone. Then, slowly, he reached for a folder and set it aside. Without a word, he stood and walked past Wainwright into the hallway. Instead of heading to the yard, he turned off the main corridor and disappeared behind the door marked Records. Outside, Wainwright reappeared alone. He nodded once to the outer gate guards, two young soldiers who looked more dazed than rebellious, and unlocked the final barrier. The boys stepped forward, cautiously, as though entering an unfamiliar realm. What followed was not chaos nor ceremony. It was simple, silent giving. Each boy carried something: cloth-wrapped sweets, folded paper snowflakes, worn books with dedications scrawled inside. One of them, Alfred Dent, the same boy who had handed a glider through the fence weeks ago, carried a carved chessboard. The pieces were made from chalk and coal. He gave it to Otto, who took it with trembling hands. No one ordered the prisoners to remain still, yet they did. They didn't want to break the spell. Some knelt in the snow to speak at eye level with the boys. One boy, no older than 8, walked up to Hans and said, "You look like my brother. He's away in Africa. He's kind, like you." Hans didn't know what to say. He took the boy's mittened hand, nodding. Another child walked up to Otto and offered him a square of wrapped chocolate. He accepted it slowly, as if unsure it were real. The boy tilted his head. "Do you miss your mom?" he asked. Otto tried to answer. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Instead, a sharp burn rose in his throat and he simply nodded, pressing the chocolate to his chest. Lantern light flickered over the scene, throwing shadows across the snow. In those moments, the fences seemed to vanish, not because they were gone, but because no one was looking at them. That night, we weren't soldiers. We were just sons who hadn't been home in too long. Weeks had passed since the snowfall that changed the character of Camp Barley Edge. The Christmas night that blurred the lines between captor and captive had left an imprint on everyone, though few dared speak of it aloud. The silence that followed was not the cold, institutional silence of military life, but a gentler quiet, one that hummed with the memory of lantern-lit faces, paper snowflakes, and children who sang across fences. But, as with all things that deviate from order, the moment came when bureaucracy would demand its due. On the morning of January 17, 1945, a matte gray Humber staff car rumbled up the gravel path to the camp gates. Snow flurries clung to the windshield as the vehicle hissed to a stop, and 2 British officers in trench coats emerged. One was thin, severe-looking, with the brisk air of a man used to ticking boxes. The other, older and stockier, paused to light a pipe beneath the frozen eave of the guard hut. This was Major Clifford Hensley of the War Office's Inspection Division. He had been assigned to audit disciplinary consistency in rear-line internment facilities, following a flurry of anonymous complaints about inappropriate fraternization and moral leniency toward enemy detainees. Camp Barley Edge was not named outright, but the coordinates were clear. Commander Reginald Fry stood on the edge of the main courtyard as the staff car pulled in, his greatcoat buttoned to the collar and cap squared. He saluted crisply as Hensley approached. "Major," Fry said, "you'll find the books in order." "I imagine I will," Hensley replied, puffing once before pocketing his pipe. "But I'm here for more than books." What followed was a slow, thorough dissection of Camp Barley Edge's December activities. Hensley interviewed guards, reviewed watch logs, and examined parcel records. He paced the barracks and stood in the mess hall, where Otto Kessler happened to be scrubbing tin trays. The prisoners were cautious, but no longer afraid. The storm of war had moved elsewhere. Wainwright, summoned to the administration office for questioning, expected consequences. He had, after all, unlocked the gate. He had allowed the children through. He had made a choice between protocol and what he believed was right. Hensley closed the door gently behind them. He did not sit. Instead, he glanced out the frost-laced window, watching 2 German prisoners haul a sack of coal across the yard. "Private," he said, "tell me honestly. What happened that night?" Wainwright inhaled sharply. "They sang," he said. "The boys. English carols first, then a few in German. Some of the prisoners cried. I unlocked the gate, supervised them myself. There were no weapons, only baskets." "Why did you do it?" Wainwright's brow creased. He had replayed this question in his head countless times, and yet the answer always slipped from neat definition. "Because," he said slowly, "I thought maybe the war could end earlier, if just for one night." Hensley studied him. Then he nodded, just once, and said, "Do you think they'll remember the rifles or the songs?" By the time the inspection ended, Fry had prepared himself for the inevitable reprimand. He had even begun drafting a defense, citing unique morale conditions and a controlled civilian interaction incident of limited scope. But Hensley offered no lecture, no reprimand. He signed the ledger, thanked the commander for his cooperation, and returned to his car. Back in London, a clerk at the War Office named Douglas Fielding was tasked with drafting the formal summary report. He worked from Hensley's notes and prepared a document recommending disciplinary review of unauthorized civilian access to military grounds. The draft memo was clear, concise, and damning. It was placed in the outgoing tray marked URGENT. But somehow, whether by oversight or quiet design, it never arrived at its destination. A junior aide, overwhelmed by end-of-year filing, mistook it for a duplicate and shelved it in a cabinet reserved for closed cases. It remained there, forgotten. Years passed, then decades. Hans Eberhardt, the teenage conscript who once stood speechless before a child offering him shortbread, had long since returned to civilian life. After the war, he trained as an engineer in Dresden, later immigrating to Hamburg, where he built bridges and raised 2 sons. In 1972, now a retiree with thinning hair and a walking stick, Hans returned to England. Not for politics, not for bitterness, but because of something he had dreamed about more times than he could count. Langridge had changed. The moorland was still wide, but the school had new walls and a paved lot. Inside, amid displays of local history and faded wartime photos, stood a glass cabinet. Within it, a wooden glider. Its wings were rough, hand-carved, painted with crooked RAF circles. The placard read, "Gift to the enemy." Christmas, 1944. Hans stared for a long time. A teacher noticed him, offered a cup of tea. When asked if he knew the boy who made the glider, Hans shook his head. "Only met him once," he said, "but I never forgot." What none of the men in Camp Barley-Edge had known was how the Langridge boys had assembled those gifts. Mr. Brigg had simply posed the idea, expecting resistance. But the town, a town that had lost sons to U-boats and air raids, responded not with anger, but coins and scarves and food rations pressed into small hands at doorways. The children carried them down muddy paths, their boots wrapped in burlap against the snow, not knowing exactly why they did it, only that it felt right. And that made all the difference. In the end, it wasn't the war that broke us. It was the mercy that healed us. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of compassion, forgiveness, and shared humanity even in times of conflict. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, peace, and understanding across nations and generations.